Hello, and welcome to the seventh in this series of short films about foundational concepts in economics. In this one, which follows on directly from the one about the knowledge problem, we look at the idea of spontaneous order. This is an idea that has been expressed and used by many economists, most notably by the person who is often seen as the founder of the discipline of economics, Adam Smith. But it's not confined to him. It's a recurring theme in the work of many economists. And also, it's worth saying, the work of scholars in a number of other disciplines, particularly sociology, for example, but also politics. Now, as we saw in the previous program, human beings face serious knowledge problems. And these knowledge problems mean that once you start to think about them, it's actually amazing that any kind of complex human order exists. But if we look around the world, clearly the world is not chaotic. It's not purely random. We do have order. Otherwise, human life would become impossible. So how is this? Where does this order come from? First of all, you need to ask the question, well, what do we mean by order? What does it mean to say that there is order in the world? Well, this is best understood by thinking about the opposite of order. The opposite of order is entropy. Entropy, as any physicist can tell you, means randomness, lack of structure, lack of predictability. And so an ordered system is one in which you have structures, you also typically have repetition, and therefore, because of those two things, you can make predictions about the future. You can't do any of these things in a purely random or entropic situation. Now, the key to understanding order in the human world is that there are two kinds of order. There's planned or deliberate order, and there's a different kind, spontaneous order. Now, planned or deliberate order is the kind we're very familiar with. This is the kind of order that you have, for example, in the military, in a company, a firm, in a large institution, such as a university, or in government, indeed, in many areas of human life. Now, it's easy and common to think that this is the only kind of order that exists. If you think that way, then if you ever see order anywhere, the conclusion that must follow is that there has to be a designer somewhere, somebody who created that order by giving orders, giving instructions, or by planning and designing that order. This is often found in theology in the shape of what is known as the argument from design for the existence of God. One of the best known examples of this was the argument of the English theologian and philosopher William Paley towards the end of the 18th century. Paley argued that if you're walking along and you find a watch, you would logically deduce from the existence of the watch the existence of a watchmaker. That's because, Paley argued, the complex order that is the watch, all the interlocking gears and parts, could not have come together spontaneously. You don't find a spontaneous process that brings together cogs and gears to make a watch. Therefore, a watch means there must be a watchmaker. And Paley said, given that we see an orderly world, an orderly natural world, we must therefore assume from that the existence of a divine watchmaker, God, who created this order. Now, about 50 to 60 years after Paley published his book, Darwin, in his great book on the origin of species, showed otherwise. What Darwin was able to demonstrate through his argument and the data he brought back from his voyage on the Beagle was that random events that take place within a particular structure, in his case, the natural environment and natural laws, can produce a complex order that was unintended, nobody intended it, nobody or nothing designed it or aimed at it. So the complex order of a great variety of species of the natural world is an example of an order that does not have a designer. So the argument of Paley's actually falls to the ground. Now, there is also many examples of spontaneous orders in human affairs. The 18th century Scottish philosopher Ferguson described these as orders that are the product of human action, but not of human design, an expression that Friedrich Hayek often quoted. In other words, you have an area of human life that is orderly, it obeys rules, it is structured, it's not random, but where you cannot say that anyone, either individually or in a group, sat down and designed that order. One very good example is language. Language is highly orderly. There are rules of grammar, rules of syntax, rules of vocabulary, rules of spelling. You don't just make up words as you go along, at least not once you've got past a certain age. On the other hand, there are very few languages in the world that are deliberately planned or designed by a designer. There's Esperanto, there's Volapük, but there aren't very many of them. The great majority of languages in the world are languages that arose out of human beings interacting with each other and developing a mode of communication with each other, but they weren't planned or designed in any way. And they continue to change and develop in ways that nobody planned or designed. New words and expressions are created, the meaning and or commonly understood meaning of words will change, but nobody actually does this as a matter of a plan or a deliberate effort to control it. People like the Oxford English Dictionary simply recognize what is going on. Now, the other key example is economic life. Economic life is another example, like language, of a spontaneous order. It's orderly in all kinds of ways. But again, nobody has planned it, and it doesn't reflect conscious intention. This is the great insight of Adam Smith, when he remarked in The Wealth of Nations that the intentions of producers, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, and all the rest of them, have nothing to do with the outcome that their independent actions produce. In other words, Smith said, the independent actions of producers and consumers produce an order that nobody actually intended to produce. They are led, in his famous expression, as it were by an invisible hand to produce an outcome that none of them intended to create. And this kind of insight is expressed by many subsequent economists, notably, of course, by Friedrich Hayek, who argued very strongly in a number of his books that the whole economic order is actually a spontaneous order produced by the accumulation of the effects of the trade, the interaction, the exchanges, the choices made by literally billions of individual human actors, consumers, and producers. Nobody planned it, nobody designed it, even at the most macro level or even at the most micro level. So what you get are orderly outcomes that are the outcome of a process that nobody intended, nobody planned to have a particular outcome, and which nobody foresaw as having a particular outcome. So these outcomes reflect the natural order, they reflect the nature of human beings, and they also reflect social institutions or rules. But other than that, there's a kind of radical unpredictability about them. There are kind of limiting factors, if you will, which mean that certain kinds of outcome to a spontaneous order are very unlikely or almost certainly impossible. But within that kind of set of limits, there's an enormous array of outcomes, and we have almost no way in the medium to longer term of working out what outcome will actually arise. Now, what economists from Smith onward have argued is that in many cases, those economic outcomes are benign. That in other words, the invisible hand mechanism, the spontaneous order mechanism, will produce outcomes which, although unintended, are actually to everyone's benefit or the benefit of the majority in any event. And so in that case, you can say that you can have spontaneous orders that produce benign outcomes. However, and this is a very important qualification, this is not always true. One of the things economists are concerned with is the way in which, under certain circumstances and given certain conditions, spontaneous order processes can produce bad outcomes, such as monopoly, for example, or prisoner's dilemma situations. And so it's not always the case that a spontaneous order will produce a benign outcome. If it doesn't, that's when you need to think about changing the structure within which the spontaneous order process happens, if you can do so, because very often you can't. Also, and this is a very important conclusion, what you have to conclude is that acting upon a spontaneous order will produce effects which are themselves unknowable and unpredictable. and they may well not be the ones that you want. And so another one of the important consequences of the idea of spontaneous order is the idea of unpredictable and unforeseeable consequences to any human action, which should lead us to be very cautious and very tentative in what we do. And so spontaneous order is one of the key ideas of economics historically. In recent years, a lot of economists have departed from it, but they should not really have done so, because this is one of the great insights of the age of the Enlightenment, and it still has a lot to tell us about the world in which we live.